Okay, good morning. We're going to talk about the insurgency of 1774 to 1776 today, and finally get to the beginning of the conflict, and then from there take it to where we see the months after Lexington and Concord, and will that actually lead to what some people think is an inevitable break with Great Britain. But first, the insurgency. This idea that it is a fairly new concept when we talk about it as far as the historical community. And a lot of this comes from a book that was published not long ago called American Insurgents, American Patriots. The subtitle is The Revolution of the People. And it kind of sparked interest in this time period from the aftermath of the Boston Tea Party in 1773 and the Coercive Acts in 1774. How did British authority come undone in the colonies in that time period? So we're looking at a 2-year period when I think we can accurately call this American insurgents a group of young evangelical colonial population, and they begin to challenge British authority and in the end make it essentially come undone in the period of about 2 years. It happens in all communities, and this is what the British can never grasp. And this is what Gage, when we focus on him in Massachusetts, can never quite grapple with, the idea that it happens all the way from New Hampshire to Georgia, but it also happens in Boston and in the outlying areas. It is resistance to Parliament. It is first spontaneous and then loosely organized militants begin to purge the countryside of Crown officials. And that's how it takes place. They also had done this previously to the Continental Congress. So this also gives a lot of, I think, important focus on the people who were doing this before their so-called leaders. We typically think the Continental Congress would initiate and the people would follow the directives of the Congress in the form of the committees of safety, and observation, they're sometimes called. But I'll say this is already going on before the Congress meets. This is in a direct response to the Coercive Acts, when news of that reaches the colonies in the spring of 1774. Congress will not meet until September 1774. So it does happen. That group known as the Founding Fathers, such as they're labeled, will benefit from the everyday actions of very ordinary people in the colonies who teach them in some ways how to invent a very highly and new effective ways to form a popular resistance all throughout the different colonies. This is an American uprising. It is not just Massachusetts. It is not just New England, as we're going to find out. It can be small acts such as sending support to Boston, as many of the colonies do, and in other cases it's simply meeting in extra legal forms when the official government of the colony says you can no longer meet and hold your official sessions of the colonial legislature. You just do it on your own. But it's little things as well, as we're going to find out. It begins sometime in mid-1774, this resistance to the king's government. Thousands of people who had never held office or imagined that it was their right to hold office become leaders in this popular uprising. They come up with new ideas, how to make sure that British authority doesn't exist anymore in a relatively short amount of time. Gage sees this in Boston. In 1774, he tells his superiors in England he's facing not just some radical leaders stirring up some of the people, but that his opposition is ordinary farmers. They're angry. They're armed. Not a good sign for Gage. As we see in this story, he's going to, it seems, to his bosses back in England, lose his nerve and come undone in the process. But Gage is on the ground, so he can more accurately tell people back in London, hey, my soldiers are getting fired on. They are blocking roads. The resistance controls the communication in and out of the city. He's witnessing a rising of the people. And that's why he'll say, I need more soldiers to end this, finally. Or he'll even, as some people in Massachusetts will come up with an idea, simply suspend the Coercive Acts. And you take the winds completely out of the sail of the resistance if you were to do that. But the English aren't going to, of course. So in late 1774 and early 1775, local communities begin to take control of the colony. They already started that before Congress met, and then the First Continental Congress meets September, October 1774, and other committees are following the orders of the Congress. Again, they're saying, look, you need to carry out non-importation, non-exportation, and you need to make sure that people do not consume, and that's where you have the directives coming from Congress in the form of the Committees of Safety, sometimes called Committees of Safety and Observation, and they go in place by early 1775. These are what can effectively be called shadow governments. You want to give them another name. Illegal meanings of the people that are outside the official bounds of the colony, and more importantly, beyond the reach of the official people who are running the colony. The British officials in the colony can't control it. We'll shut down the legislature. We'll meet in a tavern. You can't meet in Boston. We'll meet somewhere else. And all of that, of course, you're keeping an eye, especially if you're in Massachusetts, on the comings and goings of the soldiers. You're gathering intelligence. You're developing a very intricate spy network. You're also planning, if there is any proposed movement of soldiers, to watch the soldiers and then tell people in outlying communities. The principle of the express riders, they're going to become critically important in Massachusetts in the spring of 1775. Beginning in May to October in Massachusetts of 1774, the colonists begin to purge the region of office holders. This is the birth of the insurgency. So I will tell you again, it's happening before the Congress meets to tell them to do this and to put together these unofficial shadow governments. Typically have this idea that it's a top-down movement. It's not at all. Congress leads and tells the colonies, to fast forward this story a little bit, to declare independence. But let's face it, Massachusetts, and Gage says this, and the people in London recognize it, the colony is in open rebellion by the end of 1774. And the other colonies will follow, and then Congress will say, oh, okay, maybe we should finally declare independence. And the different colonies are saying, we already are. We're waiting for you. It's not you telling us to do it. It's us giving instructions back to Congress. We are independent now, take the next step. So that changes the story a lot, that it's a grassroots movement, this so-called insurgency. I think it's a great name, not one we would apply necessarily to this time period, but maybe should. And the book that started that continues. There are books that are just called 1774, the real start of the American Revolution. There's a book called 1775, A Good Year for a Revolution. So you see it happening here. It isn't, the beginning isn't sometime in July 1776. It had been going on before that. It had been going on for nearly 2 years before that, to be more accurate. So the start of the insurgency can be even traced back to the Boston Tea Party. People held their collective breath. How are the English going to react to what we did, dumping all of this tea in the harbor? Some think it had been simply over the top. It was a overkill as far as the protest is concerned. But then they seem justified in dumping the tea because they hear about the coercive acts. Oh, this is how the English are going to drop the hammer on Boston and Massachusetts? Okay, so what we did was kind of maybe a good thing. Again, even folks like Ben Franklin said, look, the tea being dumped in the harbor was completely over the top. Now folks are saying, well, maybe it wasn't over the top. They get their narrative all out of place because look what the English did in response. So they think in the resistance, these are punitive measures. They are strict. They are meant to isolate and punish, and maybe even some folks are thinking starve Massachusetts out. That's not the case at all, but that's what people believe. It's another way is to give it a more modern equivalent. The coercive acts are like Pearl Harbor or 9/11 in American memory. It elicits the same kind of, we might say, outrage, not only in Boston, Massachusetts, in New England, but outside it. It seems like the English are bent on personal humiliation of the people of Massachusetts. And all of this connects to the overall narrative now, the narrative that has conspiratorial ideas behind it, but now seems more the truth, that the English literally mean to reduce the colonists to a state of slavery. But with an insurgency, you have to ask the question, will it take off beyond Massachusetts? If this is a Massachusetts and Boston rebellion only, it's not going to succeed. So proclamations begin in places like Connecticut. Now we're dealing with the greater New England area. Connecticut says there will be protests to the coercive acts, especially when soldiers are beginning to occupy the city of Boston. They see that also they're tampering with the government. So there's a general response to the Massachusetts Government Act, which again says that the council around the governor is going to be appointed by London, and that they're replacing the civilian governor Hutchinson with General Gage. Again, that brings up a lot of resentment. Then, of course, there's a reaction to closing of the Boston harbor. So communities outside Boston say, fine, the goods will come in through Salem, they'll move in over land, and Gage has to deal with that, controlling the outside areas of Boston. So support for the citizens in areas around the city after news of the coercive acts in the spring of 1774. Farmers begin to contemplate the best ways to resist the coercive acts. And there's more and more of a sense in the colonial literature that's printed in the colonies that, well, they really do, the English, mean to treat us as second-class citizens. Some communities decide in their own way that they're going to stop sending their tax money and duties to Boston. Anyone who's known as sympathizing with the British point of view, if they're a pro-British collector, nope, they're not going to get money. They're withholding funds. That's not a good sign. The courts stopped meeting as early as 1774, and juries refused to be sworn in. So you can't have any court proceedings if there's no jury. This is not a good development for the British officials. When the judge demands the people who refuse to be sworn in for their oath to serve on the jury, they simply say, I'm not going to tell you. And what the juries are often who are summoned go out somewhere else outside. They go to a local tavern and they tell the crowd why they have decided not to take the oath and serve on a jury. It's a form of protest. So by the summer of 1774, to put this in a timeline before even the Continental Congress meets, the people of New England begin to create what we might call a meeting culture and make individual decisions. No taxes will be paid. Close the courts. Refuse the orders from militia officers who are appointed after 1774 if they are known to be loyal to the English crown. In August of 1774, Thomas Gage, governor of Massachusetts, announces the names of the individuals who will serve on the Legislative Council of Massachusetts for the colony. This is, again, a way to take it away from the decisions made within the colony, and they will be appointed. This is a part of the Massachusetts Government Act. So naming these folks, your name, once you're on that list, puts you in a difficult position. They were called, in the notes, terms in the notes there, the mandamus counselors. And when your name is on that list, it immediately puts you in harm's way, and you fall under the threats of the committees of safety, which weren't even, in many cases, formed yet, but the equivalent of that. These different groups throughout the different colonies said, all right, we're going to find out who these folks are and make life difficult for them. So this is all part of the Massachusetts Government Act. Again, this is one of the sections of the coercive acts. It has unintended consequences. This is not what the English thought would happen. They were going to take the role of the people choosing this council around the governor and give it to the governor and actually pick in London those mandamus counselors. But it actually declared open season for these officials. You didn't risk taking this job. Timothy Payne is one example. He's the first to fall. He's visited by 1,500 people in the town of Worcester. He writes out his resignation to the group. I don't want the job. Joshua Loring was awakened by a group sent by a just mob, as he identifies them. He refuses to resign as a mandamus counselor. Mob says, okay, we'll be back. We'll see you again. Obviously to get larger numbers and more people involved. For effect, the group on the road near his house decides they're going to fire the guns. Some of them are armed in the air. That's the provocation by which, and that's all the influence that Joshua Loring needs And then when they returned the next day with more people, many of them, of course, armed, Joshua Loring is long gone. They see his son there. His son answers for him and says, yeah, my dad went to Boston. And then from them, they demand the son. They demand his actual resignation, to which the son says, I can't do it. He's holed up now in the safety of the British soldiers in Boston. So this is how you, again, make sure British authority doesn't happen. So we see these marks of spontaneous protest in Boston when the mandamus councilors decide they're going to quit. Reports also reach Gage from outside the city. Dead horses block the road. That's just a sign of, again, a mutilated horse was there to say, okay, we're resisting British authority. People would walk out of a church when a minister who was known to be loyal to Great Britain began a sermon. Appointed sheriffs begin to join the resistance. Those who were supposed to be most loyal to Great Britain and carrying out the coercive acts, they end up joining the resistance as well. One poor man had to suffer through a fake tribunal, who was one of the stronger loyalist sheriffs in a community. He was sentenced to hard labor in a local jail. This is the rising of the people. Even one action, as innocuous, it seems like no controversy could be generated by this new public action. The colony decided that they were going to write a public thanks to outgoing Governor Thomas Hutchinson. Remember, he gets replaced by Gage. Now we have military and civilian authority in the form of one person. So the idea originates with a group of leading lawyers and merchants. Anyone who signs the letter of thanks to the outgoing Governor Hutchinson, their names will be published in the newspapers. Since most of the folks in Massachusetts blame Hutchinson for the coercive acts. Let's keep this in mind. Remember the letters. Franklin publishes the letters that were written after the Townsend duties, 1767, 1768. But they're published at the time of the coercive acts. So everyone thinks, once again, Thomas Hutchinson is the one who recommended, the curtailing of liberties was the phrase he used in those letters. So why not target those who signed the letter telling Hutchinson, thank you for your loyal service as you return back to Great Britain to be replaced by Thomas Gage. One man who put his name on the thanks was accosted at an inn, chased out of town, and had rocks thrown at him as he ran away. A local doctor in Maine, who had not been as enthusiastic enough about resisting the coercive acts, he's confronted by farmers who place him on a wooden hogshead, which is where you store different products like wine or sugar or hogsheads, and guns are pointed right at him. They gather around him, they put him on the hogshead, and they say, look, you need to be on our side and make sure that you actively resist, as the columnists increasingly call it, the coercive acts. So we get public resignations, the thanks for the governor. If you sign it, you're going to find yourself in hot water. It's beginning to erode the authority of England, Massachusetts, and outside of Massachusetts. In other words, the resistance is telling people it's very difficult to remain neutral. You're with us or you are against us. Next, the common cause begins to develop up and down the American coast. Common American cause. This is the unknown in the aftermath of the coercive acts and Massachusetts alone dumping the tea in the harbor. Would Massachusetts and their cause resonate with other colonies? In other words, would the insurgency build outside Massachusetts? And the answer is yes. Overwhelming aid begins to pour in from small communities of middling sorts, acting from compassion, reacting to what they see is the stringent measures of the British under the coercive acts. Remember, closing Boston Harbor except for food and fuel, meaning basic food and firewood. Okay, if that's the case, if you can only ship those things, communities up and down the American coastline begin to respond. Windham, Connecticut sends a flock of sheep to Boston with a note explaining how they identify with any workers again, who are of common cause in that community. Savannah, Georgia sends 63 barrels of rice and 122 pounds sterling, which can help the Boston poor. With the harbor closed, nothing going out, only food and fuel coming in, it's going to create a massive amount of unemployment. And the city poor rolls are going to expand, so money coming in from other colonies is very much appreciated. South Carolina will not be undone. They decide they are going to send 205 tiers, or that's a measurement of rice, but 42 gallons of rice. Alexandria, Virginia sends flour north to Boston. Monmouth, New Jersey, where your humble professor was raised. 1,200 bushels of rye, 50 barrels of flour, cattle, butter, corn, firewood, all coming from the Garden State. New York sends brandy. When they're criticized for sending alcohol, their response is literally, you need something to wash all of that food down with. Here's some alcohol. Each community decided to also send a letter of explanation. This is why we are doing this. This is why we should do this. And the other part of their letters is very important. They make comments to summarize them in one phrase. Your struggle is ours. Not a good development if you are the English. Gage starts sending increasingly desperate letters back to his bosses in London. My 3,000 soldiers are not enough. I need 20,000 to put down this rising of the people. 20,000, and I'll be successful at going about securing the area around Boston and keep the Boston Neck, that thin area of land connecting the mainland with Boston, and the approaches into the city safe from the resistance. The next part, of course, of the insurgency is in the aftermath of the Continental Congress, the associations, the Continental Association, and to enforce the association, you have the committees of safety, or the committees of safety and observation, they're sometimes called. That, of course, part of it was the colony-wide boycott of British goods. You had to enforce it, meaning it's your patriotic duty to, again, not consume and not to import British goods. Those locals around the different communities up and down the Atlantic coast organize these committees. Their full name, Committees of Safety, Inspection, and Observation. It's a way to patrol and enforce the boycott. It works. The value of all British imports falls from 3 million pounds sterling to 220,000 pounds sterling by 1775. That's, my math isn't always that great. What, 90%? Shocking amount. John Murray, the Earl of Dunmore, the Royal Governor of Virginia, has some of the most keen observations of what is happening. He says the vigor of these committees, the searches, the shame, the publication, is what's taking place to make sure. He's witnessing and reporting on this. This is all part of the publication of people who, again, will not participate in the boycott and don't follow the plan. That's part of this enforcement. This is, for the most part, not violent. Yes, it's terrible to have your body placed on a hogshead and have guns pointed at your head until you sign something, or getting chased out of town because you write a letter of thanks to the outgoing governor. They are lawless, but they are not violent. We don't see guillotines. We don't see, again, sentences of death, mayhem, rampant destruction. Maybe that's because this isn't a rise, and I kind of talked about the difference between England and the American system at the end of the lecture last time. Gage is watching people who believe that their liberty is being threatened. They are landowners, they are armed, and they've kind of come to their wits' end. They're ordinary people. It's not like the rebellions of other times throughout history. We don't have an American aristocracy that's rising up against the leadership. It's just ordinary people who have reached a breaking point with the empire. You knock on a door, sign a petition or not. If you don't, there's more pressure put on you, including your name showing up in the paper. Are you going to join the association? No. Okay. Next day, you open up a newspaper in Charleston, Williamsburg, New York, Trenton, New Jersey, and you see your name published. Public shunning might take place as well. This is how common folks play this part in the resistance to Great Britain. The book I was referencing, American Insurgents, American Patriots, calls it the School of Revolution, what average people were doing in 1774 and 1775. Well, these committees of safety begin to do something also significant. They function as an actual government. They begin to organize supplies. They enforce oaths, which is what governments often do. They keep an eye on loyalists, those who still think the Crown's authority is completely without question. And when Congress adjourns in October, the radicals in Congress, again, they wanted a common statement, which they did. They had the grievances that we talked about that would be sent back to London. So they wanted more, the radicals, and sometimes the conservatives there in Congress said, well, maybe this shouldn't be this strident in discussing our rights with Great Britain, but they came up with this compromise solution. Nevertheless, the radicals in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress think that the war is inevitable. They also believe and would wish that the Americans don't start it. Doesn't look good, especially for the people back in England. And if you want to make this American cause, if you call it that, one that resonates up and down the Atlantic coast, does include more than simply Boston, Massachusetts, or New England. Preservation of America, they believe it hinges on the idea that the English should fire the first shot. We'll see if that actually happens. So our story now goes to the actual aftermath of Congress. Let's pull up some notes here. Okay. When the members of the Continental Congress leave, they are feted. That means parties, celebrations. Everyone sees the group disperse from Carpenter's Hall. October 1774, there are banquets and celebrations on the road back to they're returning to their respective colonies. Some have to go as far as South Carolina. Others go from Philadelphia. The radicals like Samuel Adams back to Massachusetts. There is, however, still a divide. So they've broken up. They've decided one of the most important things they're going to do is meet again. They're going to meet in actually the following spring, May 1775. Some fear revolution and Galloway. Galloway says it just can't come to this. He can't believe it. He can't believe what he's hearing from the more radicals. Even George Washington has to have that meeting with John Adams, and Adams says, no, we're not there just yet, but we'll see what takes place. That's why we're meeting the following spring. We're going to reevaluate our relationship with Great Britain based on the reaction of what the summary view and some of the other statements we've made going over to England, what the reaction is from the king and Parliament. That's why they appeal directly to the actual king. Joseph Galloway, again at Congress from Pennsylvania, fears that there's a talk of a formal break. He knows that the prospects of life, prospects of prosperity will actually be best remaining in the English Empire. He said independence, and this is a great quote from Galloway, is an ill-shapen diminutive brat, unquote. But several delegates, he had heard the words there. He'd heard people talking about it. With steps taken now to create these binding non-importation, it had to be enforced locally. These are the extra legal assemblies that will begin to carry on the business of the colony when the official government is either shut down or when it does meet, it actually talks about ways to enforce the American Union and follow the dictates of the committees of safety and observation. In Boston, General Gage watches them even after he ends the legislature. The official legislature, they padlock it, they try to keep it from meeting, they just adjourn and meet somewhere else. Boston decides that their official shadow government will be called the Provincial Congress, and it first meets in October of 1774. That should be 4 in the notes, sorry, not 5. October 1774. By 5, the shooting's already started. So what people do, and it's Gage who says, look, as the governor, I am authorized to not allow the actual provincial Congress to meet, to which they say, okay, we're going to meet anyway. And they hold elections for the provincial Congress. And what happens is amazing in some ways. Communities that typically send 20 different delegates to the Massachusetts General Court, they elect 40. They also represent more counties in the western areas of Massachusetts. That is a sure sign that the resistance is strong in the outlying areas. Congress also, as part of the meeting of the First Continental Congress, approves money to get arms and ammunition. How do you get that money? Well, it's the taxes you're withholding from paying the official government. You buy ammunition. This is one of the things Gage reports back to his bosses in London. Oh my goodness, we're seeing a gathering of armed people. They are purchasing ammunition, gunpowder, flints, musket, whatever they can get their hands on, and they're keeping it out of the watchful eyes of the British authorities and the British Army. Now you're going to read in the Philbrick book, Bunker Hill, about, and I'll mention a couple of them by name. One is the Salem and Suffolk powder alarms that they're called. This is the general belief that Gage, with these 3 upwards of 4,000 soldiers, is going to march out at some point and try to confiscate and grab, based on his own intelligence network. And he's going to go find the storage of military supplies and go seize them, confiscate them. So everyone thinks, oh, it's going to happen, and they mobilize for that. That's why Massachusetts is really, really tense in the fall of 1774, spring of 1775. So these committees of safety could, among other things, order the militia into action. They also set aside part of the militia known as Minutemen. These are militia that will get ready very quickly, literally with a gun sleeping next to it, their musket, so they can be ready in case there is any threat. Some folks in western areas, the new elected members of this so-called provincial Congress, they insist that Boston should essentially be evacuated of people and then burned with the soldiers inside the town. You know, you can seize the control of the neck, prevent all the soldiers from getting out, and basically fire the whole city. Similar actions take place in Virginia. Again, it belies the fact that this is simply a Massachusetts or New England rising of the people. The provincial government closes down the courts in late 1774. They also ask a question among themselves in the current state of affairs between Virginia, not just all the colonies, and the people of England. So should the English farmers and planters pay their debts to England? In response to the Continental Congress, half of Virginia counties pick committees to enforce the Continental Association. That is significant. That means you have more than half of the support within the colony for the enforcement of the association, which means that that is part of it, non-exportation and non-importation, beginning in 1775. This is how the enforcement will take place. Most Virginians support this measure. Again, it's short of going to war. It seems to be a logical next step. Non-importation, non-consumption of British goods has worked in the past. We're going to do it again. And almost all of the counties by early 1775 begin to carry this out. Public shame will follow you, just as it did in Massachusetts. And it's a powerful weapon for any violators who do not participate in the non-importation agreements. So they would set up these committees. They would go around saying, all right, put your name down, planters and merchants, sign the association that you will be part of the boycott. Those who refused are deemed enemies of the country. So it's now treasonous to follow English law and to defy the new official illegal government of the colony. It affects all levels of Virginia. Parents tell their kids not to go to school if you find out that your teacher had expressed political opinions in favor of Great Britain. Anyone publishes letters that might talk about support of Great Britain. They are scandalous, and then you should tell your parents, and their parents will report, of course, to the committees of safety. This is obviously a repressive system. It's going to quash free speech and free expression. It's patriotic more and more if you import goods or to not import goods and refuse to sign the agreement. Again, you can witness a lot of public humiliation. Individuals also had published papers and different, again, statements in the newspapers that were critical of the Continental Congress. They were then visited by committees of safety and told to turn their letters over. So you're employing terror here. Your speech is being controlled. Newspapers are censored. Dissent is crushed. Things that we criticize that the English had been doing and that other oppressive regimes had done throughout history. But it's all in the name of stopping items coming over from Great Britain and the West Indies to make sure that non-importation was a reality. And if you had goods on the shelf already, if you were a merchant in these different colonies, and Virginia is one example, if you had things on your shelf to sell, it would be very tempting to go increase the prices because you know you weren't getting more. Effectively, what they did, these committees of safety told the merchants, if you're going to sell them, and some were not allowed to sell them in these communities. So non-consumption, meaning you don't buy new stuff anymore. That's one thing. Other communities said, all right, empty out your shelves, sell what you've got there with the understanding you weren't going to sell more. But those items that you are going to sell, here are the prices by which you can sell them at. Again, just another part of what was taking place. Some merchants see their names in the paper when they violate association agreements. That's going to mean something because if England comes to a census, changes his mind, there's no need to continue the non-importation agreement, you're still going to be the person that tried to import items. And your name is always going to be connected with that. And that's not a good thing if that's where your livelihood exists. Local committees, by the beginning of 1775, were controlling and governing the colonies. The legislature wasn't in session. Instead, the provincial congresses were. The governor of Virginia prevented the local militia from drilling. George Washington just drilled anyway. So things are happening beyond the reach of the official government of all of the colonies. Taxes are now being collected that went to supplying the defenses of each colony. And if you don't pay your taxes for that, say you are someone very loyal to Great Britain. I mean, the committees of safety, you notice part of their full name is observation. This is neighbors spying on neighbor and getting an idea of where their political views are. And if they're wrong, they're going to make life difficult for you or print your name in the newspaper. If you decide simply because you are loyal to Great Britain that your taxes under this new kind of shadow government, you're told, look, the taxes that we now collect are going to go to buying up, finding the different military stores around the colony. You say, what, to shoot at British soldiers? No, I'm not going to participate in that. Then your name might be listed as well. In England, King George III. Now, there's always this idea. Now, this gets back to the mindset of the colonies. That George III was not involved in this. How could he really ever permit? How could he permit things like the coercive acts from being passed in Parliament? He wouldn't, because he's not capable of that. He has to understand what this means for our status in Great Britain. And what the colonists don't realize, what the resistance doesn't realize, is that George III is heavily involved in this. So they keep appealing to him. You know, when they start every kind of protest in writing that goes back to England, they say, we are loyal colonists to Great Britain, and to you, the King George III. Maybe they're thinking they can appeal to him to change the minds of members of Parliament when he's going along with them. George III remains steadfast in his resolve to cow the colonists and make them fall in line. They must obey the coercive acts, he says. He considered from the get-go the Continental Congress, once he got wind of its meeting, which would have been late 1774, early 1775, he considered them, did the king, an illegal body. The die is now cast, he said. The colonies must either submit or triumph. I do not wish to come to severe measures, but we must not retreat. By coolness and an unremitted pursuit of the measures that have been adopted, I trust they will come to submit, unquote. There always, George III said, has to be a tax on them. In this case, he favored the tea duty of 1773. This wasn't done without his consent. He wasn't involved. He didn't, again, weigh in on the measures. He was part of it. Lord North, his newest prime minister, pledged if the colonies don't trade with Great Britain, they don't trade with anyone. They're beginning to talk about an idea of shutting down all trade with the colonies as a result of these non-importation, non-export agreements. That means nothing goes into the colonies, which they're actually going to carry out later that year. General Gage in Boston begins to realize that he has to carry out some of this enforcement of the coercive acts to keep the port closed. The port being closed means that American smugglers have a field day. Items come in through different areas. All of the islands, harbors, rivers, creeks could now unload goods, and he says, I'm going to prevent this from happening, if he actually, in fact, can. Smuggling follows immediately after the harbor was closed. He also was witnessing the closing of the courts, the existence of the provincial Congress. This worried him. And he's beginning to understand. At first, his letters said, again, they're becoming desperate letters too. He said, look, I'm not up against some people in Boston. I'm up against a lot of organized individuals. I'm not up against just people in Boston and Massachusetts, but more and more he's referring to all of New England. And his plight with just 3, and eventually he shifts some soldiers, so he gets about 4,000 soldiers in actual Boston. Again, he moves those soldiers from New York and Canada into Massachusetts, asking for, again, reinforcements. And the letters convey his concerns over what's happening, the desperation that is involved. And then he even throws out the idea that possibly we can suspend the coercive acts. Mentioned that earlier, and I'll repeat it. Why not, he says, take the wind out of the sails of the rebellious colonists and have nothing for them to protest? It's an interesting point, but no one in Parliament seems to be listening. The king and the council share his concerns, but they never entertain this idea of repealing the intolerable acts. It's absolutely unthinkable. No, not at all. George III believes, quote, New England governments, when he gets word of the provincial Congress, this is George III, the king, New England governments are in a state of rebellion. Blows must decide whether they are to be subject to this country or independent, unquote. Blows must decide. They don't send Gage more soldiers. He wants 20,000. They send him 3 new generals. Their names are there in the notes. Generals Howe, Clinton, and Burgoyne leave for North America as Gage decides what to do next. I'll read you now a passage from the situation, the book that really explains the situation that Gage finds himself in. As wintry March gave way to April and the softer spring weather in 1775, 6 months had elapsed since the adjournment of the Congress. America and the colonists had changed during that period, and the political changes in the year since news arrived of the intolerable acts had been especially breathtaking. Royal authority had disappeared throughout much of the American landscape. The importation and sale of British goods had ended, and citizen soldiers were training. A transformation appears to have occurred as well in the thinking of many colonists. The emphatic goodwill, even deep affection that once existed toward the mother country had been replaced by a sour mistrust that often bordered on loathing. Whether or not they fully understood it, the colonists were becoming to see themselves as more American than as British American, and increasing numbers were, like Jefferson in his summary view, no longer willing to acquiesce in, quote, 160 electors in the island of Great Britain, giving law to 4 million in the states of America, unquote. Most may not yet have come to long for American independence, but the vast majority desire greater independence from the sway of the mother country and were willing to fight for it. Gage is also given permission after he gets a letter saying no more soldiers, just 3 officers to help increase your backbone. But you're also given what we would call carte blanche, blank check to say, all right, you can go out into the field. You can round up the gunpowder, military supplies that are gathering in places like Charleston, outside Charleston, Massachusetts, not Charleston, South Carolina, near Boston, and he knows of these happening in late 1774. This rallies the militia from outside the city, and it clears a path for Boston and the armed people there to fight. So Gage decided to further strengthen the Boston neck. He brings in artillery, again, cannons to make sure that it can't be stormed by the Massachusetts militia. Again, that neck is a thin stretch of land which led to the city. He pays more and more officials within Boston to try to give him, again, intelligence of what's happening as far as the resistance is concerned. The Patriots also have, the resistance has a very effective group of individuals who are getting news from the English as well. One of them we think might be his wife, Gage's wife. Margaret Gage was an American born in New Jersey. They were married in 1758. They had 11 children together. But it is known that we've always wondered who within the British High Command in Boston might have been feeding information to the resistance, and a lot of people think it might have been her. Again, there's a lot of disagreement about that. We also know that some people who seem to be part of the Patriot or the resistance cause could be bought. One of them you'll read about in the book, Dr. Benjamin Church. He's actually serving in the provincial Congress. So he's in a place where it's understood his allegiance is to the resistance, not understanding, and in fact, he's funneling information to British authorities. The stories Church, again, he sees firsthand what's happening. The stories Church told about the inner workings of the resistance are very unsettling to people like Gage and his other junior officers. So Gage understands he's a good officer. As a trained military officer, when you're besieged in an unfriendly town, you should maybe go on the offensive. And that's what he begins to consider in the spring of 1775. He has his scouts survey the roads outside of Boston. If I were to march in force, where could I go? What are the approaches? And what are the best ways to take? And how do I put all of this together in complete secret? So this is logical. You go look at the logistical manner in which you would make your way into the smaller towns, such as Concord, Cambridge, Monotony, maybe going through Lexington. One patrol in civilian clothes is actually accosted. Again, patrol means a small group of soldiers. They shed their uniforms and put on civilian clothes. But this tells you something about how the resistance knows about the movement of the soldiers. They are told to go back to Boston. Everyone knows you're soldiers. You're out there gathering intelligence. You should probably, for your own safety, return. That's interesting. So a group of soldiers can't even travel outside of the city without being potentially threatened. Engaged by early 1775, cannot even send a squad of soldiers out, a small group of soldiers, into the countryside without any alarm. I mean, 10, 20 soldiers move from one area to another. They know about it. The resistance knows. They have the express riders already set up. Among those who report the activities is Paul Revere. Artisans are a designated team of express riders. One of them is an unemployed tanner himself. Anything out of the ordinary that they see is reported to the Committee of Safety. By 1775, in the spring, Gage is preparing to capture stores of weapons and capture, if he can, if it's possible. The weapons are the primary mission. But if he can actually capture elements of the Congress, the leaders of the resistance, that would be the icing on the proverbial cake. By April of 1775, instructions from the ministry arrive. That letter he feared he was going to get, he gets. You're not getting more soldiers, General Gage. Deal with it. He has 4,000 soldiers. Unfortunately, there are 16,000 people in Boston, many of whom are armed, and he's not sure about their loyalties. You don't need more, the ministry tells him. You are facing a rude rabble challenging your authority. Gage knows it's different than that. The ministry doesn't seem to know it's different than that. So there's a complete disconnect with the ocean in between. Don't provoke anything, they tell him. Don't meet the Massachusetts militia in open battle, but go out, seize the munitions, arrest the leaders. You have the soldiers to do it. They're some of the best in the world. Put it together and make it happen. This letter to Gage truly speaks volumes about how absolutely clueless the ministry is in a situation in Massachusetts in spring 1775. But in the end, this letter gives him full discretion. It's up to you. You want to move out and do something? You can do it. You have our permission. Any operation with the troops that you want to command, do it. Capture arms, ammunition in two of the communities, if you can identify them. One is Worcester, the other is Concord. And that's what Gage begins to put together in April of 1775. He decides he's going to cobble together a force of his 4,000 soldiers. He organizes what might be accurately called something of a strike force, about 700 soldiers that he puts together. The first of many mistakes that he makes in the planning of this is to detach certain soldiers he thinks are elite in his army, but they often don't fight together. So you take elements of your army. For instance, you take the light infantry, which are soldiers who have shorter coats, their ability to move very quickly. You also, of course, detach grenadier elements. These are the shock troops. These are the taller soldiers. They're supposed to be, once upon a time in the grenadier regiments, you had to be 6 foot tall, and you wore that woolly hat that you sometimes see in artist rendering of the British Army. The issue with this is that you don't have any unit cohesion here. So what takes place is it would show that later on in the movement out from Boston through Lexington to Concord. The officers also don't know each other. The man in charge of the infantry, the overall command is given to a pretty competent officer, but the infantry is John Pitcairn, who is a Marine. The Marines are attached to the British Royal Navy. So they're the soldiers on the ships, but he's on a ship. He's not used to exactly organizing this force on land. Okay, so we'll actually go to what happens up here, and I've got a couple of slides in the aftermath and dealing with the early battles here. Let's see. There's Paul Revere. This is the one I wanted to bring up. Okay. Revere already told Samuel Adams earlier in April 1775 that the British were planning some kind of expedition to capture him and John Hancock. He knew this as early as April 16th. When the British move on the night of the 18th, it is effectively the worst kept secret in town. The Express Riders, there are 5 of them, and then there are more. We know Revere is one of the most famous of the Express Riders. We also know that the resistance had put together a very careful signaling system by which, if the British soldiers were to move by land, they would hang one lantern in what was known as Christ Church in Boston. If they were to move by sea, meaning they would take off the ships in individual rowboats and then make their way to land that way, you would hang 2 lanterns. So the signal went out when probably about 10 o'clock on the night of the 18th, the soldiers were on the move. And again, on the night of the 18th, Revere goes out, as do the other express riders. Again, this had been already set up, prearranged. Paul Revere had experience being an express rider because he brought the Suffolk Resolves from Massachusetts to Philadelphia the year before. So the soldiers march out west. Let me show you this. This is the map of several of the actual express riders. There are 3 that we know about, Dawes, Prescott, and Revere. There are 5 who are fanning out from Boston. And you can see that Paul Revere is in the blue. He goes from the Charleston, and this is a good representation of Boston. You can see it nearly looks like an island with the Charleston Peninsula to the north, Roxbury there to the south. So Revere goes out to an area where he thinks, well, the Lexington road is going to be very crowded with soldiers because the British had also deployed cavalry, that they're going to go out and make sure that any express riders are captured. And so Revere thinks, I'm not going to take the main road, I'm going to take a secondary road. So he goes on the Mystic Road. You can see his path there in blue. Dawes and Prescott go out as well. Dawes covers probably more ground. He goes directly from Boston itself. Revere is captured. He evades his escape by a couple of soldiers that he sees blocking the road. He's on apparently a very fast horse. There's a great book. I used to assign it for this class called Paul Revere's Ride, which picks up in the aftermath of, just like our other book, the Boston Tea Party. But it is very painfully detailed about what Revere and the other express riders did, and it goes all the way up through the battles of Lexington and Concord. When the British made their way, again, west from Boston towards Lexington, you can see it right here. There's Buckman's Tavern. That's where a lot of the militia and the officers who commanded the militia were actually waiting. Now, Concord would be about a military expedition. Again, Gage wanted to go farther, wanted to go to the other area, Worcester. Worcester, Massachusetts was 40 miles from Boston. He decided that soldiers cannot, in a day's expedition, go 40 miles and back. Again, you think, oh, it's like a 40-minute drive, maybe an hour on back roads. No, it's not exactly that. If what you're dealing with is soldiers who are marching over roads that can be, again, you might see some resistance there. So they decide it's going to be Concord instead, 20 miles west of Boston. When they get to, let me pull up the other slideshow here because this is the aftermath of the battle. What I wanted to show you is the gathering of the soldiers who are, let's see if we can pull it up here, waiting for them in Lexington. Aha, this is what the soldiers would see. Again, the artist representation, let me see if that's, I don't know if that's being shared, so let's go back and try that again. Okay. All right. There we go. There are a new number of paintings, obviously, of the Battle of Lexington, and this one is not an idealized version, as you would often see done in the immediate aftermath, but probably 40, 60 militia gather in what's known as the Lexington Green. It's a park-like area with buildings all around it. It's still there today. They still do a reenactment of the battle every April 19th. You can see also in this slide that the British are deploying as they would. It might not be easily to see. Let me okay, it might be a little easier to see it this way. You can see the British commander there on horseback. The British didn't have good cavalry. They should have for this operation, but they didn't. They also realized that if you can't catch a guy on horseback, you're not really going to be able to stop any news spreading because news moves as fast as someone can take it on horseback. The other thing I'll mention before we talk about this battle, and it's not much of a battle, is the popular conception, and it comes into play with the famous poem, the Longfellow poem about Paul Revere. Listen, my children, and you shall hear the midnight ride of Paul Revere. That Revere and others did not say the fabled story is the British are coming, because that didn't make any sense. Most people think of themselves as British in Massachusetts in 1775. He would have said something remarkably different that got people's attention. The regulars are out. The soldiers are on the move. This is a community and set of towns that was already on high alert because they realized, ever since the previous fall with the various powder alarms, it wasn't a question of if, but when the soldiers would try to capture the different munitions that the resistance had scattered outside of Boston, which they hoped was hidden, except that we know Gage knew about it because he had an internal kind of spy there, working, who was supposed to be loyal to the cause, but it was actually more loyal to Great Britain. So this is the clash that takes place. The British officer probably would have yelled something along the lines of, "Put down your weapons, you damn rebels." Something like that. That's what some of the surviving militiamen said they heard. But no one did. And would have also ordered them to disperse, which they didn't either. And so Captain Parker, we know, is in charge. There's a monument there that says something along the lines of "Stand your ground, you know, don't put your weapons down. If they want to start a war, let it begin here." He probably would have said something like, let's put our weapons down and disperse, or let's just disperse. It's probably a good idea. You've got several hundred of them and just a few of us. But it doesn't happen. And this is one of those moments in history where the second hand on the clock just slows down, because this is one of those fabled scenes in history where a shot is fired somewhere. Who knows where? It could have come from someone firing out the window. It could have come from a militia soldier who was leaving Buckman's Tavern, who would have tried to be gathered on the green here and fired his gun. If you entered into a building, it was traditional if you had your gun loaded, even if you didn't put the ball down the gun. If you had loaded it with powder, you would fire the weapon to clear it, make sure it wouldn't go off inside and scare the hell out of everybody. So that would have been the case. Or some people like to theorize that Sam Adams or John Hancock, like there's a grassy knoll for the Kennedy assassination, the grassy knoll for Lexington, one of them would have fired a gun and made someone very jumpy. We do know that the British were not ordered, but they fired into the crowd of militia there on Lexington Green. 8 of them fell in the volley, which you can see the aftermath in this slide. The militia then carries off the dead and wounded. The British soldiers continue to march and make their way through Lexington towards Concord. This, again, you can see the different style of painting. This is a more kind of folk style painting, which is showing us the gathering of soldiers near Concord. So that's the destination of the Army, the 700 soldiers, the strike force that's sent out on the late 18th to early 19th. Now we're getting into the early part of the day. The soldiers had marched at night. The idea is get there and back, 20 miles each way, not finding any resistance, meet in secret. Well, the battle at Lexington, not much of a battle, but again, that shows that there was significant resistance and everyone knew that they were moving. They found in Concord some musket balls, flour, and trenching tools, hardly worth the trouble of sending out 700 soldiers. Then it looked like to some soldiers who were keeping an eye on the British, they were guarding one particular bridge in Concord, and they saw smoke emanating from the town. And they said, some of the soldiers there, and the officers are trying to figure out what's going on, but the militia at Concord said, "Oh my God, they're burning the town." And then they moved to try to get into the town from outside. And that's when they had an actual exchange. Gunfire was taking place between the soldiers, British soldiers, and the militia. And at this point, something different happens. Nobody was killed on the British side at the Battle of Lexington. At the Battle of Concord, they fired on the British soldiers, and there was bloodshed, killed and wounded British soldiers. That's why they typically call the Battle of Concord, although it's on the same day as the shot heard round the world. The British decide that they had found nothing and are going to make their way back. An organized withdrawal, not a retreat, a withdrawal out of Concord. For the first mile, it was peaceful. Okay, making our way back. We're going to be late afternoon, back in the safety of Boston. We've got cannons guarding the neck. we have more soldiers, where there's only 700 of the total force that had marched out, and we make our way over there. And we get about a mile down the road, and then the entire, it seems, militia of New England had descended on the road in between Concord and Boston. It's represented here in this slide. This is often called Battle Road. You can see to the very left of the slide, the North Bridge. That's where the fight took place, the first one in Concord. This represents the the yellowish flashes of where the different militia represented in this slide had taken on and attacked the British column. You can see on the left side a column of, that's light infantry with the helmet kind of hats coming up to disperse the militia. They fire thousands of rounds. They probably hit some of the soldiers, but most of them miss. You can see again that it's somewhat organized, but not very well organized as far as the attack on the soldiers, and that these militia have no real uniforms. They're wearing different tricorn hats, which are basically large floppy hats with one corner of it tied up. You also see some of them retreating, some of them staying and shooting at the column as they're moving along. On the far side, this is a great accurate representation of what these different firefights would be like, and they happened all along. You can see right here, Bloody Angle. You see the return, and every time there's a bend in the road or a place where the column has to slow down, they are attacked. So we can say right at this point, again, the first mile, you don't see a lot of resistance, but at this point on the map on the left, you see Merriam's house. They call it now Merriam's Corner, because this is the beginning of what we might think is about a 16 or 18-mile gauntlet that the British have to go through to get back to Boston at different intervals. Shortly after sunset, the exhausted British column reaches the safety of Boston. 700 went out. The British have 273 casualties. We have no idea how many colonial militia are killed or wounded, maybe in the dozens, maybe larger. The first battles of the American Revolution are unlike any other that follow. You'll never see a battle this big take place over 16 miles. They're more set battles throughout the rest of this long, long conflict. The myth of the militia also is born here at Lexington and Concord, a myth that will take years to live down. Militia is equal to the redcoats. Look at how he had punched the British in the face. And the Battle of Bunker Hill, that you're going to read about, which happens a couple months later in 1775, reinforces this idea. Americans make great soldiers, and the militia alone, unlike the corrupt regimes of Europe. We don't need a standing army. We have the militia. And all of those, again, represented in this painting, who had put down the plow and picked up the musket off the mantle and marched to the sound of the drums and the cannon. Well, not always the case. Are they equal to redcoats? Not really. But there was also a perception that England, after this point, would have to put down an entire civilian rebellion, because now you've got a large army gathering outside Boston. That also wasn't always the case, because the patriotic enthusiasm Americans had for the war came in waves, and sometimes it ebbed. And so if you rely on the militia, the volunteer citizen soldiers, when things don't look good and they go home, what do you need? You might need a standing army to actually stand and fight the British and to sustain this conflict, because at this point it's going to last, they don't know it yet, 8 years, 108 months. Almost immediately after the battles of Lexington and Concord, militia from the different colonies begin to converge on Boston. Let me show you the map one more time. There's the Boston Neck. What happens is that the militia that had gathered around the time of the Battle of Concord literally besieges the soldiers in Boston. And that's going to happen through the spring and summer of 1775. The next question, obviously, in all of this story is, what next? Let me remind all of you that we have between April 1775 and the important, significant vote of July 1776, 15 months in between Lexington and Concord and when Congress votes on independence. 15 months. It is never inevitable that these colonies, even after there is bloodshed, will declare themselves independent, because there is still a very strong movement that says we can't do it. Absolutely not. We can't win. We don't have the resources. And someone is still hanging on to this ray of hope that England will come to their collective senses. Cooler heads will prevail. They'll repeal the coercive acts. But can that actually be the case after the King's soldiers were fired on? They were dead and wounded British soldiers at Lexington, or especially at Concord. And that's where we'll pick up the story next time.